Although they were trying to get away from medieval superstition, they still believed that evil had a face, and they looked for it in the places they feared most, the slums of the rapidly evolving cities. As urban working-class populations grew, crime exploded and prisons filled up. One man believed that if he could find out what criminals have in common, he'd be able to tap into the essence of evil itself. And he did so by studying their faces. Francis Galton, a cousin of Charles Darwin's, persuaded prison governors to send him photographs of criminals. He believed that by analysing these photos, he could isolate the face of evil.
Galton was convinced that there was such a thing as a criminal type, and that it could be possible to identify physically the nature of the criminal. Now, this assumption converged with the excitement and interest in photography, Victorian photography. Galton got busy with machinery, invented a composite photography machine, where the idea was you could superimpose individual pictures of criminals, one on top of the other. You'd get rid of the extraneous individual features that didn't matter, and you could end up with the kind of pure image of a criminal, certain criminal type.
I don't know, to me it seems almost medieval. It's this idea that you can tell evil by looking it in the face. It's almost like you can tell a witch by looking for the hidden signs on the body. It seems an odd thing to come out of a scientific age.
I think the interest in forensic photography and composite photography that we see with Galton already is building on earlier traditions in the 19th century, the belief that you can understand character through bumps in the skull, phrenology, the belief that you can understand character through expression, through facial expression. Now, Galton's cousin Darwin was also extremely interested in this whole terrain, and soon after writing The Descent of Man in 1871, Darwin produced his own book, The Expression of the Emotions in Man and Animals, which was also based on the study of numerous photographs, his own, the facial expressions of his children, pictures of inmates from asylums.
Charles Darwin's theory of evolution coincided with the rapid growth of the working class and created a new fear. If the degenerate urban underclass was breeding faster than its masters, might evolution go into reverse? Could humanity start evolving backwards towards a more primitive, a more evil state?
If you read Darwin, it seemed that the most fertile were the most fit. Living in London in the later 19th century, looking at the fecundity of the working class, particularly the underclass, he thought there must be something wrong with Darwin's theory. Instead of the more optimistic idea about evolution and progress, you get a more shadowy and anxious language about species degenerating, arguing that you could understand many forms of mental illness and criminality, alcoholism, various other social pathologies, could be understood through the umbrella term degeneration. Galton became increasingly convinced that the state ought to have a policy on biological reproduction, that you shouldn't leave it as a free-for-all of nature, but that you should actually have policies. And he coined the term eugenics in 1883.
As early as that?
As early as that, to describe what he hoped would become a new science of racial engineering. And this idea was picked up by many writers, creative writers, as well as philosophers, scientists, and also then later criminologists.
Galton's ideas spread right across Europe. In Turin, in Italy, you can still see the museum set up by the most enthusiastic of his followers, Cesare Lombroso. The death masks that Lombroso collected are marked with their owner's crimes. Murderer, forger, rapist. Lombroso believed that his method of identifying evil was so foolproof that society could dispense with any evidence of criminal acts and convict people purely because of the shape of their face.
Cesare Lombroso coins this term atavist, from atavus, Latin for ancestor. The criminal is a throwback to the past. Looks as though he's living in present-day times, but biologically is in the past. Now, Lombroso's theory powerfully challenges the idea of free will. The criminal isn't responsible, can't calculate. This has all sorts of implications for what should be done with the criminal, and ideas about reform or rehabilitation, because Lombroso believes that at least some criminals are incapable of acting otherwise. And he certainly believes that you can identify certain facial features which will lead you to the criminal.
19th century thinkers believed that science could identify and isolate what it is that makes people evil. In the 20th century, new faces of evil were to emerge, and evil itself was to move much closer to home. If the devil was the early face of evil, and the scientific age saw evil as an atavistic throwback, a subspecies predestined to wickedness, one of the key images of evil for our age has been the serial killer, from Jack the Ripper to the Yorkshire Ripper to Hannibal Lecter in Silence of the Lambs. We all have a mental image of this serial killer. I've used a few myself in my books. Sinister figures who haunt deserted streets and parking lots. But if this is a modern version of the face of evil, does it have any more basis in reality than the horned goat or the atavistic degenerate?
The type of serial killer we hear all about is what you might call the Jack the Ripper, the Jeffrey Dahmer, the Ted Bundy character, the sex killer. In fact, if you look at killers who claim an awful lot of victims, those characters are very much a minority. The emphasis is all on the really obvious Ripper sort of characters, not on the ones who are difficult to identify and difficult to pin down. And that's partly an emphasis of what the police can and cannot do. But it also suggests that the Ripper myth serves a purpose that is just that. It's a convenient social myth. It serves a purpose in creating an easily understood demon figure.
Do you think there was a change in the 70s and 80s about the perception of serial killing?
If you look as far back as we have records, we can find cases in the 1890s, the 1920s, all the way through. And in each age, people always say, this is unprecedented, this is new, there's never been anything like this before. It's part of the rhetoric that people need to make, that we are going through a dreadful age, things are falling apart. In the 70s and 80s, that meshed with the kind of moral concerns that people had about the time, particularly in terms of threats to women and threats to children. You have to understand any of those serial murder waves in terms of the people who are trying to understand the problem. Different people understand it at different times. When you have psychiatrists trying to understand it, they'll have a very Freudian approach. When you have feminist activists trying to understand it, like you did in the 1970s and 80s, then they're going to emphasize the idea of the sex killer. So you have to understand, if you like, the consumers of the problem, because they're as important as the problem itself. By the way, that also affects another of the big errors that popular culture makes, because women serial killers, in fact, are very common. If you take serial killers we know about, they make up about 25% of cases. But when you consider that women are likely to kill in means that are less likely to show up and be detected, it's probably about 50-50. Serial murder probably is an equal opportunity kind of offense.